The transport ship shuddered as it broke through the Scarn containment field, and Captain Elena Reyes understood, in that moment, that she was the last one. Not the last soldier standing. The last commanding officer of the 11th Fleet still capable of drawing breath. Admiral Okonkwo was dead. Commander Petrov was dead. The 43 ships that had jumped into the Vesic system 3 days ago were now debris fields catching the light of a dying orange star. Elena had watched it happen from the bridge of the Meridian, had given the order to disengage when disengagement meant nothing anymore, and had been dragged from the wreckage by something with too many limbs and no mouth she could see. She did not know, yet, that she was being taken to the Queen. 3 days earlier, the briefing room aboard the Meridian had been full of noise. Officers arguing over the projected Scarn advance. Okonkwo's voice cutting through it all with the flat, unhurried authority of a man who had commanded fleets through 2 prior wars and intended to survive a third. Elena remembered the way he'd tapped the star chart, the Vesic system glowing amber under his finger, and said the word acceptable about a set of losses that, 3 days later, would include himself. She had argued against the deployment. She had lost the argument. She had followed the order anyway because that was the job, and because Okonkwo had never once been wrong about a calculated risk in the 11 years she'd served under him. He had been wrong this time, or perhaps he hadn't been. Perhaps the 11 ships that made it out under his final order were exactly the acceptable loss he'd calculated, and the wrongness belonged entirely to the universe, which had simply decided that this particular gamble would cost more than any of them had budgeted for. Elena did not know yet which of those was true. She suspected she would spend a long time not knowing. The corridor she walked through was not built for human proportions. The ceiling arched high enough to admit creatures 3 times her height, and the walls pulsed faintly with a bioluminescent film that brightened and dimmed in a rhythm she couldn't place. 2 Scarn soldiers flanked her, their carapace plating the color of wet slate, their movements too fluid to be mechanical and too precise to be animal. She had seen recordings of them in briefings. Nothing had prepared her for the sound they made when they breathed. A low clicking hum, almost musical, entirely alien. She kept walking. There was nothing else to do. The chamber at the end of the corridor opened without warning, the wall simply dissolving into an aperture, and Elena stepped into a space that made her stop breathing for a full second. It was enormous. A cathedral built from living tissue, ribbed with structures that looked grown rather than constructed, lit from within by the same pulsing blue-white glow. And at the center of it, suspended in a lattice of cables and membrane that might have been technology or might have been part of her own body, was the Queen. She was larger than anything Elena had trained herself to expect. Her upper body held something almost humanoid in its proportions. A torso, arms that ended in long articulated fingers, a head with 2 eyes set in a face that could, if you squinted and lied to yourself, be called almost beautiful. Below the waist, she disappeared into a mass of coiled, glistening bulk that vanished into the dark of the chamber's lower reaches, connected to the ship itself by strands of translucent tissue that pulsed with the same light as the walls. The Queen's eyes found Elena immediately. There was no scanning, no searching. She had known exactly where the human would be standing before Elena arrived. "You are the last one," the Queen said. Her voice did not come from a mouth. It arrived inside Elena's skull, translated by some implant or field Elena couldn't see, rendered in perfect, unaccented English. "The last commander of your fleet who still draws breath." "So it would seem," Elena said. Something in the Queen's expression shifted. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "You are not the first to stand where you are standing, Captain Reyes. You will not be the last. I have asked every commander who has stood in this chamber the same question, across 40 conquered worlds, across 400 years of expansion. I find their answers instructive. Sometimes I find them entertaining." Elena said nothing. She had decided, somewhere in the wreckage of the Meridian, that she would not perform for this creature. She would not beg, and she would not posture. She would simply answer honestly, for as long as honesty was permitted to her, and see how far that got her. "The question is this," the Queen continued. "Why should I spare your species?" The chamber was silent except for the low hum of the ship's living architecture. Elena felt the 2 soldiers behind her shift their weight, an almost imperceptible tension, as if they expected her to fall to her knees. Instead, Elena asked a question of her own. Who was the last commander to answer that? Before me. The queen's head tilted, a gesture so close to human curiosity that it was almost worse than if she'd shown nothing at all. An unusual response. Most begin pleading before I finish the sentence. I'm not most people, Elena said. Humor me. What did he say? For a long moment, the queen simply looked at her. Then, without moving, without any visible signal, a section of the chamber's tissue wall shimmered and resolved into an image. Recorded, Elena understood, by some organic sensor woven into the queen's own biology. It showed a man in a uniform Elena didn't recognize, dark green with silver piping, standing in this same chamber, before this same queen years or decades earlier. His face was gray with exhaustion. His hands were shaking. We have resources you do not, the recorded man said, his voice thin and stretched. Rare minerals in our outer colonies. Manufacturing capacity you haven't seen. Spare us and we will serve the hive. We will build what you need. The queen did not respond in the recording. The image simply ended, and the wall returned to its blue-white pulse. He offered value, the queen said, as did the one before him, as did the one before that. Resources, technology, strategic position, political alliances against rival powers I had not yet encountered. Every commander who has stood where you stand has offered me a reason my conquest of their species would be less profitable than my restraint. Some of the reasons were persuasive. I spared 3 of those species, not out of mercy, Captain Reyes, but out of appetite. They were more useful whole than consumed. And the ones who weren't persuasive? They are why 40 worlds now speak with one voice, and it is mine. Elena felt the cold of that settle into her chest, but she didn't let it show on her face. She had spent 11 years learning not to let fear reach her expression. First in flight school, then in combat command, then in the long gray silence after Petrov's ship went dark on the comms and she'd had to keep giving orders anyway. She held the queen's gaze. So, the queen said, you have heard the pattern. Now give me your answer. What does your species have that makes it worth more to me alive than dead? And Elena laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It came up out of her chest before she decided to let it. A short, genuine bark of laughter that startled even her. And it was the laughter, more than anything she said afterward, that made the 2 soldiers behind her go rigid with what might have been alarm. The queen's eyes narrowed, fractionally. You find this amusing. I find it familiar, Elena said, once she'd caught her breath. You've been asking the wrong question for 400 years, and nobody's told you, because nobody who stood here lived long enough to have the conversation. Silence again, but a different quality of silence this time. Elena had spent her career reading the mood of rooms full of people who outranked her, learning to sense the exact moment a superior officer's patience was thinning or their curiosity was sharpening. She couldn't read Skarn body language the way she could read human faces, but she could read attention, and she had all of the queen's attention now. Explain, the queen said. You keep asking commanders what their species is worth, Elena said. Resources, technology, alliances. You're asking them to argue for the survival of a civilization, a whole species judged as one thing, one asset, one line item you weigh against the cost of conquering it. And every single one of them answered you that way because that's what you asked for, and because that's what commanders are trained to do. We think in terms of the fleet, the colony, the species. We're trained out of thinking about ourselves as anything other than a function of the whole. And you are different. No, Elena said. That's the point. I'm not different. I'm just the first one who's noticed what you're actually asking, underneath the question you think you're asking. The queen's fingers, long, articulated, faintly translucent at the joints, curled slightly against the lattice that suspended her. It was the smallest motion. Elena filed it away as the first sign she'd gotten that this creature, for all her 400 years and 40 worlds, could still be surprised. You have not answered the question, the queen said. I'm not going to answer the question you asked, Elena said. I'm going to answer the one you meant to ask if you'd thought about it clearly. You want to know if humanity is worth sparing. I can't answer that. I'm not a representative of humanity. I'm not a delegate. I don't have the authority to negotiate on behalf of 9 billion people I've never met, and neither did the man in that recording, and neither did anyone else who stood here and tried. All any of us can actually answer for is ourselves. Then answer for yourself. Elena took a breath. Behind her, she was aware of the soldiers, of the vast dark reaches of the chamber falling away into shadow below the Queen's coiled bulk, of the wreckage of her fleet somewhere above the atmosphere of a planet she didn't even know the name of. She thought of Petrov's voice on the comms, cracking as the Vashti went dark. She thought of Okonkwo, who had ordered the retreat that saved 11 ships and cost his own life to buy the time. I have nothing to offer you, Elena said. No resources, no technology, no alliance. I am a captain of a fleet that no longer exists, standing in the chamber of a creature who could end me with a thought, and I have absolutely nothing that would make it strategically unwise for you to do so. And I am still not going to kneel, and I am still not going to beg, and if you kill me in the next 5 minutes, the last thing I will have done with my life is refuse to perform usefulness for you. That's my answer. Not what my species is worth. What I am worth on my own with nothing behind me. And the answer is, I don't know what I'm worth to you, and I've stopped caring, because that was never the question that mattered to me in the first place. The chamber went silent. It was not the silence of a pause before a response. Elena had heard that kind of silence in negotiation rooms, the beat before someone chooses their next words. This was different. This was the silence of something enormous, coming to a full and total stop. The Queen did not move. Her eyes remained fixed on Elena, and for the first time since Elena had entered the chamber, something in that ancient, alien face looked less like a monarch weighing a transaction and more like a mind that had walked into a wall it did not know was there. Seconds passed. Then a full minute. The two soldiers behind Elena shifted again, and this time she was certain it was unease. They had clearly never witnessed their queen fail to respond to anything. Elena did not know, standing there in the pulsing blue-white light, that she had just done something no human, no member of any of the 39 other species catalogued in the hive's vast collective memory, had ever managed to do in the 400 years of the Skarn expansion. She had given an answer the hive mind could not process. To understand why the Queen's silence lasted as long as it did, it helps to understand what the Skarn actually were. Something Elena would not learn for several more hours, and something the Queen herself had never had reason to articulate before that day, because no one had ever asked her to. The Skarn were not, technically, a species in the way humans understood the word. Every Skarn born into the hive was born linked, not merely communicating with the collective consciousness, but partially constituted by it. A Skarn soldier did not decide to follow and order the way a human soldier weighed and chose obedience. The order arrived already as intention, already as motive, indistinguishable from the soldier's own will. Because the collective's will and the individual's will had never, in the history of the species, been meaningfully separate things. The Queen was not a ruler in the human sense either. She was closer to a focal point, the place where the hive's distributed consciousness gathered densest, where its judgments crystallized into decisions, where for 100 years of accumulated Skarn experience resolved into a single voice that could speak and choose and conquer. Every species the hive had ever absorbed, it absorbed by the same evaluative process. It measured the species as a whole, weighed its usefulness as a whole, and made a decision about the whole. This was not cruelty. It was, from the hive's perspective, simply how value existed. A being that had never known a self separate from its collective had no framework for evaluating one. This was why every commander who had ever stood in that chamber had answered the way they answered. Not because they lacked courage, but because the question, as the Queen posed it, had a shape that fit only one kind of answer. Species worth. Collective value. What can your civilization contribute to mine? It was also, though the Queen would not have framed it this way herself, why the Skarn had never once been defeated. An enemy that thinks collectively can be modeled collectively. Its leaders can be isolated and its populations predicted, because the pattern that governs one Skarn governs all Skarn, scaled up or down without meaningful distortion. 40 worlds had fallen not because the Skarn were stronger in every engagement, but because the Skarn always knew with near-perfect confidence what their opponents would do next. War, for them, was less a contest of force than a very long exercise in accurate prediction. Elena had not answered that question. She had, without fully realizing the scale of what she was doing, refused to answer as a representative of a collective at all, and in doing so, she had handed the Queen a concept the hive mind had no architecture to hold. Individual worth, disconnected from collective utility, was not a concept the Skarn had ever needed. It had simply never come up. And now, standing at the dense, crystallized center of 400 years of collective consciousness, the Queen found herself trying to process an idea that did not fit into any of the categories her entire species had ever built. "Say it again," the Queen said, finally, and her voice, for the first time, had lost the smooth, unaccented calm it had carried since Elena entered the chamber. "The last part. Say it again." Elena kept her voice steady, though her pulse was not steady at all. "I don't know what I'm worth to you, and I've stopped caring. That was never the question that mattered to me." "What question matters to you?" "Whether I did right by the people who trusted me," Elena said. "Whether I gave the order that got Okonkwo his 11 ships out, even though it cost him his life because it was the right call and not just the safe one. Whether I stood here in front of you and told you the truth instead of a strategy. Those are the questions that matter to me. Your question, what my species is worth, that's not mine to answer, and honestly, Your Majesty, I don't think it's the question you actually need answered." "Then what is?" Elena hesitated, not out of fear, but because she was genuinely thinking, turning the question over the way she'd turn over a tactical problem on the bridge. "I think the question you need answered is whether a species that thinks the way we do, where every one of us can, at any moment, decide we're worth something apart from the whole, and act on that regardless of what it costs the collective, is a species you can predict. Because you've conquered 40 worlds by knowing how species behave in aggregate. You know how a hive mind responds. You probably know how a strict hierarchy responds, and how a democracy responds, and how a theocracy responds. But you have never, in 400 years, had to predict a species where the fundamental unit isn't the collective. It's the individual. And every individual can go off script." The Queen was silent again, but it was a different silence than before. Not the paralysis of the first minute, but something more like calculation, vast and slow, running through channels Elena couldn't see. "You are suggesting," the Queen said slowly, "that your species cannot be reliably conquered, because it cannot be reliably modeled. I'm suggesting you should think very carefully before betting 400 years of unbroken success on the assumption that we behave like everyone else you've absorbed," Elena said. "I'm not threatening you. I don't have the ships left to threaten anyone with. I'm telling you the truth because it's the only thing I have left to give you, and because I think, for reasons I can't fully explain, that you're the kind of mind that actually wants the truth more than you want another surrender." The Queen did not answer immediately. Instead, she did something that made the two soldiers behind Elena drop into a posture Elena would later learn was reserved for moments of profound uncertainty within the hive. A kind of collective stillness, spreading outward from the Queen through some channel Elena couldn't perceive, rippling through the ship itself. "I must consult the depth," the Queen said finally. "The depth. The accumulated judgment of the hive. For 100 years of Skarn who have lived and died and left their patterns woven into the collective. I do not decide alone, Captain Reyes. I decide as the place where all of them converge. And in 400 years, no commander has ever given the depth something it did not already know how to weigh. And now I do not know what the depth will say, because I do not know how to frame the question you have given me. I have never had to ask the collective to evaluate the worth of a single unlinked mind, considered entirely apart from its civilization. It is possible the depth will find your answer meaningless noise, an anomaly, nothing worth altering 400 years of strategy over. It is possible it will find it means something has changed in what conquest requires going forward for a species built the way yours is built. Elena said nothing. There was nothing left to say. She had given everything she had, not a strategy, not a bargain, just the plain truth of who she was and what she valued, offered without the armor of representing something larger than herself. Whatever happened now was out of her hands, in a way that felt, strangely, less like helplessness than like relief. "You will remain in this chamber," the Queen said, "while the depth considers. The consultation took 11 hours by Elena's internal clock, though nothing in the chamber marked time the way she was used to measuring it. The blue-white light pulsed on, unchanging in its rhythm. The queen remained motionless in her lattice, eyes open but unfocused, present in some sense Elena couldn't name and absent in every sense she could. The two soldiers stood at their posts without shifting, without apparent fatigue, and Elena eventually sat down on the tissue floor of the chamber, back against a warm, faintly pulsing wall, and waited. She thought about Okonkwo and about the order he'd given, the order that had, in its own way, mirrored what she'd just done. He hadn't fought for the fleet as an abstraction. He'd fought for 11 specific ships and the specific people on them, made a specific, costly choice, and paid for it with his own life without ever framing it as a grand strategic necessity. He'd just done the right thing because it was in front of him to do. She wondered whether that was, in the end, the actual difference between her species and the queen's. Not intelligence, not technology, just this, the stubborn, inefficient, occasionally self-destructive insistence that a single choice, made by a single person, mattered on its own terms, whether or not it served anything larger. At one point during those 11 hours, one of the two soldiers broke formation. A small thing, barely noticeable, a half-step closer to where Elena sat against the wall. It crouched, joints folding in a way no human skeleton could have managed, and regarded her with eyes that held no expression she could read. It did not speak. It did not need to. She understood, somehow, that it was simply looking at her the way a person might look at a strange object washed up on a shore, turning it over without touching it, trying to guess at its function. After perhaps a minute, it returned to its post. Elena never learned whether that soldier had acted on its own impulse or on some faint ripple of the queen's own uncertainty, passed down through whatever channel bound them together. She was beginning to suspect that, for the Skarn, there might not be a meaningful difference between the two. She must have slept at some point, because when the queen's voice returned inside her skull, it startled her upright. "The depth has spoken," the queen said. Elena got to her feet, steadying herself against the wall. "And it does not know what to make of you," the queen said. "This has never happened before. For 100 years, and the depth has never returned an answer of pure uncertainty. What does that mean for me?" The queen studied her for a long moment, and there was something almost like respect in the way she did it, though Elena would spend the rest of her life unsure whether she was reading that correctly or simply wanting to. "It means I am not going to kill you, Captain Reyes. Not because you have persuaded me to spare your species. You were correct that you have no authority to negotiate that, and I would not have accepted the offer if you had tried. I am not going to kill you because you have introduced a variable into 400 years of certainty, and killing the only data point I have would be, by any measure the depth respects, an act of profound stupidity. So what happens now?" "Now?" the queen said. "I delay." "Delay what?" "The invasion of your homeworld. I had a fleet prepared to move within the month. That fleet will not move, not until I understand what it is I would actually be fighting. You have told me my species has never encountered a civilization built the way yours is built. I intend to find out whether that is true, and what it means, before I commit 400 years of unbroken success to an assumption that may no longer hold." Elena felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but something quieter. A door that had been closing had, instead, cracked open. "That's not a victory," she said. "That's a delay." "It is the only kind of victory available to you today," the queen said. "I would not waste it wondering whether it should have been larger." They did not become allies. They did not become friends. In any sense either of them would have recognized the word. Elena Reyes was held in the Skarn Dominion for the better part of a year, not as a prisoner exactly, and not as a guest, but as something closer to a specimen the queen returned to again and again, asking questions that circled the same territory from different angles, testing whether Elena's answer in that first chamber had been a singular anomaly or a genuine feature of how humans built meaning. She never fully understood what the depth had made of her, or whether the delay the queen granted humanity would hold for a year, or a decade, or only until some other commander gave the hive a reason to stop wondering and start conquering again. She understood only that she had walked into that chamber expecting to die making a point, and had instead bought her species something no fleet, no weapon, and no alliance had ever managed to buy it before. Time, and a question the most successful conqueror in 400 years of Skarn history did not yet know how to answer. When she was finally returned to human space, deposited, without ceremony, into a shuttle that drifted toward the edge of a listening post near the Sol system's outer defenses, she carried with her a single recording, given to her by the Queen without explanation. Contained no strategic data, no coordinates, no warning. It contained only the Queen's voice, speaking 11 words into the silence of the shuttle's empty cabin as it fell toward home. "Tell your species," the recording said, "that I am still listening." Elena Reyes sat with that recording for the rest of the journey, watching the pale blue curve of Earth grow larger in the viewport, and understood that she had not saved anyone. She had only made herself impossible to ignore, and for a species facing an enemy that had never lost, that, for now, would have to be enough. The listening post's commanding officer met her at the airlock with a medical team and a dozen questions she wasn't ready to answer. She gave them the recording first, before anything else, before her own name, before a request for water, before the debrief that would consume the next 6 months of her life. She watched the young lieutenant's face change as the Queen's 11 words played into the quiet of the docking bay, and she understood that the sentence would travel from that room outward in widening circles, through command staff and intelligence briefings and, eventually, into whatever passed for public knowledge once the Admiralty decided how much of the truth the rest of humanity could bear to hear. She was debriefed for weeks. She repeated the story of the chamber so many times that it began to feel less like memory and more like a shape she could trace with her eyes closed. The pulsing blue light, the Queen's stillness, the 11 hours against a wall that breathed. Analysts asked her, again and again, whether she believed the delay would hold. She told them the truth each time. She didn't know. She had bought a door left ajar, not a door thrown open, and doors left ajar could swing either way depending on who leaned on them next. What she did know, what she carried with her into every briefing room for the rest of her career, long after the scars of Vesic had faded to something she could discuss without her hands shaking, was that she had not been spared because she was clever, or because she had found some trick of language that outwitted an ancient mind. She had been spared because, for one unrepeatable moment, she had refused to be anything other than exactly what she was. One person, alone, answering for no one but herself. It was not a strategy anyone could have taught her. It was simply the truth, offered without armor, in a room built to weigh entire worlds. Somewhere beyond the edge of charted space, in a chamber lit by a slow blue pulse, the Queen was still listening. Elena intended to make sure that when the silence finally broke, it would not be humanity's fleets that answered first, but the same plain, unarmored truth that had bought them this much time in the first place. The end.